This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 280. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is Can You Have Too Many VDEVs? A Practical Guide to ZFS Scaling.
Yeah, so quite often we get asked, how many VDEVs is too many? And in this article, we dig into some of the details and even talk about some cases where we have pools we've built with 400 VDEVs and why you might want to do that.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. A couple of related stories. Firstly, one from Germany, Digital Trust in Danger When Authorities Forget Their Old Domains. And then a Krebs article, Most Park Domains Now Serving Malicious Content. The German one is interesting. You've got a bunch of government agencies that changed their name and therefore changed the domain that they were using, and then eventually stopped paying for the old domain, let it lapse. Other people then picked it up, and then it turns out that some of the internal systems were still using the old domains and sending data to them. Not ideal.
No. So yeah, in this example, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, which before 2005 was called the Federal Office for the Recognition of Foreign Refugees. So the website went from bafl.de to bamf.de, and they had a redirect in place for years, but after 20 years, they thought, well, we don't need this redirect anymore. But as you would expect to happen, somebody quickly grabbed up the domain. Turns out for a while, it was actually a website that had questionable information about asylum issues and those needing temporary residence and so on. And then eventually a security researcher discovered that it was available for registration. But as Joe mentioned, when he registered it, he noticed some of the traffic was actually coming from inside the house. And some old systems were still trying to use subdomains and so on of the old domain. And suddenly, whoever buys that website now gets that traffic and can give it whatever answer it wants. And judging by the way some of this has been done, I'm guessing not all of it was using SSL and verifying the identity of the remote site. But even if it was, because we generally do domain control verified SSL certs, yes, I am the correct owner of this domain now, so I can get a legitimate SSL certificate for it.
This reminds me a lot of an issue that we covered a while back with an auto-discover bug. Microsoft used to have Outlook, the mail application, automatically fall back to various different domain names with auto-discover in them that Microsoft never owned, was never intended to own. Again, security researchers started registering a few of those potential auto-discover domain names and discovering that not only could they do that, but in fact, they suddenly got just a bajillion password resets and whatnot that should have gone into auto-discover. I really want to have some kind of pithy, like this is what you need to do answer for this, but I don't. Because what the German agencies failed to do, when they let those domain names lapse and they allowed somebody else to register them, I don't know that there's any answer other than keep paying for those domain names until the freaking end of time. Because even if you don't have any leftover code in your own systems that points to those domains, and even if you wouldn't go leaking information to those external domains that you had hard-coded inadvisably in old code that you hadn't reviewed, maybe you cleaned everything up on your own site perfectly. Well, what happens when somebody who is in a vulnerable position and needs information as a refugee and knows that the old domain name is where everybody goes to get information about that, goes to the wrong place? And, maybe it's a hate group that specifically wants to harm refugees. There's no technical fix for that here, and it doesn't even necessarily require losing a domain name. Now, we're left being like, well, if you have an important enough mission, do you need to squat a whole bunch of domains around yours that might get mistaken in order to safeguard people who might, get fooled by this kind of thing? That doesn't scale well. So it's hard to come up with an answer, because ultimately what we're really talking about trying to figure out how to do is how to secure the human mind. And nobody's figured that one out yet.
Although the biggest thing that some countries have done is creating a restricted namespace. So for the US, anything that's officially the government is .gov. And in Canada, it's .gc.ca for the government of Canada. Or I think the UK is .gov.uk. having some protected TLD, even if it's a second level one, like gc.ca or gov.uk, that no one can get a domain in here unless it's from the government. And that way, if it expires, it just now doesn't resolve. No one can come back and pick it up for $7 from any domain name registrar. But to Jim's point, that doesn't solve the problem entirely. It turns out the Federal Institute for Public Health in Germany always creates temporary, like pithy domain names for different campaigns. Like they're trying to, do a vaccine drive or, had COVID things or whatever. Oftentimes these are temporary marketing campaigns. So they have a nice short name that you can remember when you hear it on the radio or whatever. But 10 years later, they have to keep paying for these hundreds of domains they've collected over time from different campaigns. And when they let them lapse, they're popping up links to illegal online casinos, and a website that used to distribute children's songs is now full of malware and all these other kinds of issues.
And if you're not sure why scummy actors might do that, when specifically what we're talking about, these promotional campaigns, there's like, okay, we're going to make a funny domain name and we're going to push, like John Oliver does this all the time for his show on HBO. He'll do a sweepstakes, or, he'll try to drive people to some New Zealand bird contest or whatever, and he'll make his own short-lived domain for the promo, and he'll run that, and, then it will essentially be done. Now, the reason that you'd want to pick up one of these after it lapses is because it was used for a short-lived promotional campaign. And what that means is a very large company dumped a whole bunch of money into pouring a whole lot of Google juice into that domain. And it's going to take a while before all that Google juice goes away. When they first pick up that domain, it's like it's just been prepped for them and it is ready to reach a ton more people than some random garbage new domain that they picked up, or, just some nonsense. So yeah, these things are very valuable, and now you have some idea why. I do want to return to the idea of the protected TLD. The protected TLD is a good idea, but it doesn't even have to be a TLD. It can be just as simple in a lot of cases, like maybe you're not a government organization. Maybe, you can't really get this big branching, whatever. Well, you don't need that. Just make subdomains of the domain that you do live and work with that you are absolutely keeping track of and that nobody else gets to mess with. If the only auto-discovered domain had been autodiscover.microsoft.com, there never would have been a security issue in the first place, because Microsoft actually has control of that. Nobody can register subdomains of Microsoft.com. The issue was that autodiscover.com was allowed, as was autodiscover.br and every other TLD you can think of, and a lot of those domains never existed, but it would just automatically randomly try them.
Well, in particular, I think it was actually auto-discover unqualified, and that way it would add whatever search domains were in your DNS and so on. And yeah, it got way out of hand. And it turns out the Germans are trying that. They have both bund.de and gov.de, and their new kind of digital umbrella and brand for all of the government stuff. But they say, it's still in the pilot project phase, it's not mandatory, and getting all the different government departments to actually register all their new domains under these and migrate all the websites and so on is going to be a big thing. But I think in the end, it'll be worth it because, as we saw, there's real harm that comes when official websites stop being official websites, but are still viewed as being the official website.
It always cracks me up when organizations are like, oh my God, we can't possibly migrate to a different domain name for our thing. It's so hard. Like, okay, I get it. You're operating at scale, and scale makes everything harder than it would intuitively appear to be, but we're still talking about something that can be fixed with regular expressions. Like, if you can't manage this, what you're really telling me is I'm not competent to manage my day-to-day operations, because even the simplest possible restructuring is just baffling me.
Yeah. Like the times I've changed the domain name of a website is quite a few. It's a pain, but it's not that hard.
Who out there is actually typing in domains these days? Like, not that many people.
I still am, and I still get an eye twitch when I watch other people type sometimes literally the whole domain into Google.
Yeah.
Instead of into the address bar, and then getting ads for not the website they tried to go to and then clicking on it.
What pisses me off is that the browsers now try to auto-detect whether or not you're ending in a TLD, and if they don't recognize the TLD, it sends you to the search engine instead of even trying to resolve in DNS. I'm like, I have private DNS, you piece of crap. But if you don't actually type out the full http:// whatever dot your private TLD, the browser won't take you there. It will send you off to a search engine. And in some cases, there may even have been confidential information in the URL that was in the address bar, all of which just got sent right off to Google.
Yes, although that might actually be because of the risk of sending out that DNS query, even if it doesn't exist, leaking that information to your ISP. But I've come down on Jim's side of this, of check my DNS, but there is an argument in the other direction about, would it be worse for your privacy to leak everything to your ISP or your government instead of going over HTTPS directly to your search engine and seeing if what you're searching for exists?
Right. But that's why I said who out there, not you two. I'm talking normal people.
Well, I'm guessing a good chunk of the people that listen to this show still type URLs into address bars, but I do know that a lot of your everyday people do not. And that, I think, is part of this problem, is that the search engine can just as easily send you the wrong place. We've seen lots of examples of this where people trying to find the official phone number for an airline, for example, ask Google and get sent to a scam phone number there. They call and give them their credit card and think they have a ticket, and then show up at the airport and the airline's like, you never bought a ticket. What are you talking about?
Right. And that's what I was getting at. The search engines, or let's face it, Google, needs to do better.
The question is, Joe, who's going to motivate them to do better? And how?
Governments through legislation.
Who's going to motivate the governments to actually want to, slam the car door on the company with all the money in the world to put in politicians' campaign chests?
We the people.
Well, then get started. I'm waiting.
Yeah. It turns out the way to convince Google to change what they're doing is to stop using Google, but nobody's doing that. Well, not nobody, but.
What about these park domains then? I mean, this is clearly related.
Yeah, it's basically, these are not necessarily official websites, but just any old website. And yeah, instead of your typical, we just put a bunch of ads, it turns out we make more money if we put worse ads or malware directly on the websites.
I mean, that one kind of falls in the same category as fire is hot and water is wet. What were you expecting? You got a domain, you had nothing to do with it, you handed it to somebody else and said, run ads on this. And yeah, it winds up being scammy. Gee, who would have predicted?
Right. I think most of these times it's actually that, it's not somebody who owns the domain and happens to be deciding to park it. It is people buying a domain that used to have some Google juice to put the malicious content on.
But should there not be processes in place to take these domains off people who are doing this bullshit?
Theoretically, there are processes for that, and it goes through a court of law, and it all kind of needs to happen in the same jurisdiction for that to actually happen, which you may recognize as a problem on a globally interconnected network. Turns out it's real easy to just hop jurisdictional barriers when you do your very minor crime, and nobody wants to bother coordinating with the authorities in Lower Slavonia and New York City at the same time, which would be required in order to get any kind of criminal conviction. And who do we convict? Where are they? Where did it happen? This is not only an interstate crime, it's an inter-country crime. It's global. And, it only made somebody a nickel. Well, next. But, it's a lot of nickels that add up. A whole lot of nickels.
Krebs did a little research and found that a single entity, whether that's a person or a company or whatever, owns about 3,000 lookalike domains, including, Gmail without the L, Scotiabank with the A and the I flipped around, and a bunch of things like that. And just depends on people not being able to type very well.
Yeah, typo squatting, they call it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's the one where Google may actually more likely send you to the right website by seeing the typo and offering to correct it or whatever, but it doesn't really help.
That depends on whether the typo squatter bought an ad on Google that actually put them all the way at the top above the real result, which happens all the time.
Kagi, who is the paid-for search engine, put up an interesting blog post recently. LLMs are bullshitters, but that doesn't mean they're not useful.
Full disclosure, I'll pretty much click into most people's, hey, you should read this article about why LLMs suck, because, it's kind of an evergreen topic at this point. But this one was interesting because it was written by the head of machine learning at Kagi, the search engine. And it's negative in all the ways that, those of us who aren't real fond of where the industry is going would want it to be. But it's not a knee jerk, oh, LLMs suck, we hate everything about LLMs, AI is bad. Instead, he goes through and he shows you snippets of conversations with major LLMs and outlines the ways in which they fail. I think most people by now who are aware that LLMs are bad at a lot of things know that simple math is one of those things. Sometimes an LLM will tell you 2 + 2 = 4. Sometimes they'll tell you it's 5 or green. Who knows? And there are a lot of weird tricks with that. Like the LLM is a lot more likely to give you the correct answer if you ask it to please take its time and think carefully and do its best. Now, the reason for that is not because the LLM has emotions and you're releasing hormones in its brain or anything. It doesn't. You aren't. However, what you are doing is you're forcing it to go down different paths inside the model in the patterns that it's learned from trawling its data set. And when you specify, please be careful and do your best, you're starting to sound a lot like an actual instructor. And so you're more likely to get text that comes from actual conversations about simple mathematical operations. Whereas, for example, if you were just to ask the same LLM to add, let's say 3.18 and 3.37, those look like Python versions. And now you didn't say anything about Python, but there's a very non-zero chance because all the major LLMs are so concerned with modern programming languages, especially the higher level ones like Python, and Python is incredibly popular. Sometimes they'll go down the wrong internal paths and they'll give you an answer that has something to do with Python version numbers. They don't say anything about Python, but that's what's happening. And so you get a different Python version that may or may not even have some accompanying text about why that version of Python is notably different from the others that you asked about when you just asked it to add 2 different fractions that began with 3. Anyway, this is one potential failure model. There are a lot of ways that these things can fail, and he doesn't just tell you about them, he shows you, he exhibits them. And the most interesting thing to me was something that I was not aware of. There's a project called Psychosis Bench, which gives you a set of questions that you can hit an LLM with in rapid order that tends to throw the LLM off balance and discover how likely the LLM is to literally reinforce psychotic delusions in its users. Because they all are very bad for doing that. They want to make you happy. And if you tell it that you need it to tell you that it loves you and you're a special person and everything that you do is correct, that's what they'll do.
Yeah, we have done a similar article before, and just if you ask various LLMs for assistance with ZFS, and they will tell you all kinds of made up or incorrect or actively harmful things. But this really breaks down the why a lot more than we did. But the one I found the most amusing was just asking it the same math question in Portuguese, and it gets a very differently wrong answer. Seemingly partially related to the fact that in a lot of European languages, they use the comma as the decimal separator, and possibly the decimal as the thousand separator, resulting in all kinds of non-working math.
And this is the Python thing again, because when you use the commas European style or, Portuguese style, it doesn't match 3.10 anymore. Even though 3.10 is intended to mean the same thing, it's no longer matching the Python version numbers because usually the Python version numbers go out even in the European countries with the original dots because it's just kind of like a string that's passed through in its entirety. So again, you miss that wrong mental path that the model could have gone down. Now, as far as the title, LLMs are bullshitters, it turns out that is specific. It doesn't mean that LLMs are liars. Bullshitting is not quite the same as lying, at least not as laid out by the author, and I think this was a very useful distinction. He lays out the distinction as lying is what you do when you know for a fact that you want to tell somebody an untruth in order to mislead them. Bullshitting is what you do when you want to convince somebody of something and you don't genuinely know whether what you're saying is true or not because it's not relevant to you. The only thing relevant is what you intend to accomplish with the communication. So whether you lie or not is so unimportant, you might not even know. And LLMs do that a lot.
Yeah, this sounds good, therefore it must be good. Kind of exactly the bullshitting versus lying. They're not actively trying to deceive you, although there's some examples about Myanmar in the article, but they're just making something that sounds legitimate and saying that's good enough for me.
There are also some really good examples of some of the nitty-gritty about how the models are actually created in the state that they're released to the public. And the first stage is basically you've got to get the autocomplete part right. You feed it as much conversations in the language that you want it to learn. You hit it with just fire hoses of this stuff. You don't care if it's good, bad, indifferent. You let it figure out the patterns. What it's doing is basically it's figuring out, what vectors all these words associate to so that it can process language as matrix math, which it turns out is actually what neural networks do. So we do that in our own brains as well. But the beginning phase is just teaching it the language. The thing is, it also learns a lot of things that are not language because we're not feeding it primers. We're feeding it like the entirety of human communication in that language that we can find. So it gets a lot of bad ideas. Now, the next stage is you're supposed to fine tune the LLM so that it's going to be more likely to go down the right pathways and give you the right answers relevant to what you're likely to be asking it about. Now, you may already be saying, hey, but hang on a minute, ChatGPT is supposed to be smart about everything, right? It's a generalist. It doesn't specialize in anything. You are correct. And so the issue here is, although you can fine-tune a specific model to be more likely to be correct and less likely to be incorrect about a very specific narrow problem domain, you can't fine-tune it for everything because the whole point of fine-tuning is getting it good at that one thing because it's only really bright enough to be good at one fairly narrow problem domain. And when you try to make it do everything, well, in human terms, that's what we would call the Peter principle. When you just keep promoting somebody until suddenly you've asked them to do things that they can't do anymore and now they just fail flat on their face. That's what we do with LLMs. You can't fine-tune an LLM to do everything. And if you try, you actually introduce as many false negatives with your fine-tuning when somebody asks for something that was outside your fine-tuned domain as you do produce, a good outcome when somebody asks questions that are within it. Because one of the things that the fine-tuning does is it makes the model more likely to correct you when it thinks you're wrong. But what if you weren't wrong?
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Jacob writes, I'm currently rethinking my home setup and want to move some services from some VPSs to my local network. I've been using external block storage for the VPSs. My initial idea was to have one computing machine with VMs and containers, but then I shifted to the idea of moving the storage layer to a low-power, highly redundant NAS, while keeping a separate computing unit. However, now I see a trend of running containers on a NAS, so maybe I should have both storage and computing in one machine. It's good from a performance perspective, but I'm worried about the reliability and flexibility of this approach.
It is not good from a performance perspective. It is terrible from a performance perspective because you're talking about going from hyperconverged, meaning storage and computer on the same box, and your storage transport network is effectively just the PCI Express bus, to actually having to segregate compute and storage over a home lab network, which is probably 1 gigabit and is probably shared with everything else going on, including, browsing YouTube, sending email, whatever. So your performance is going to be awful if you segregate. Please stay hyperconverged. If you want to eliminate anything out of this setup, eliminate the NAS. If you need a high-powered computing device to do your high-powered computing, it's not going to save you any power to have another low-power device that you cram all the drives in. Just cram all the devices in the first box. Now, if you're a hardcore Windows user, I can kind of understand why that approach wouldn't work for you because there's so much that you can't really do or do reliably with Windows. But if this is a high-powered Linux box, one box can do it all. Run your VMs on it, have your bulk storage on it, do everything that you need to do, and don't hit the network until you absolutely have to, because that's when the performance is going to kill you. Not only from the throughput bottleneck of 1 gigabit, which is tremendous compared to what the local storage on the machine is going to be, but even worse, the latency. The latency is absolutely going to murder you. It's bad even on a dedicated storage transport network, and on a shared one, it's not going to be livable.
Yeah. Even if your throughput never touches the 1 gigabit mark, a gigabit network is going to have a lot higher latency because it's just the packets only move so fast. They only move fast enough to be able to reach a speed of 1 gigabit. So if you have a 10 gigabit network, even if you're not using more than a gigabit of the throughput, the latency is already 10 times less. But even then, it's still orders of magnitude more than if you were not going over the network at all. You were just going over the PCIe bus, because to go over your 1 or 10 or 100 gigabit network, first thing you have to do is go over your PCIe bus to the NIC, and then it has to do a bunch of work, and then you go over some other cables and on and on and on. You're going to have a lot less latency by putting all the storage in one machine. And as Jim said, if you're trying to save power, one machine instead of two is almost always going to be less power as well.
I do want to mention, since Alan was throwing around all this talk of 10 gig and 100 gig and lower latency if you do that and blah, 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 there's a lot of dragons there too.
Oh, yeah.
Don't just think that you can go out and you can buy a whole bunch of 10 gig network and immediately see 10 gig speeds. You can't, and you probably won't, because what you start seeing then is now you have to figure out how to make all of your network operations multi-threaded, because most of them by default are going to bind on the performance of a single CPU core. And guess what? One single CPU thread usually won't get you to 10 gigabits.
This isn't even talking about the throughput. This is just the latency. And even there can be a lot of dragons. Like, in order to avoid overwhelming those, especially single CPU cores that are processing the incoming packets, a lot of the NICs will do interrupt moderation and coalescing, where they'll wait and gather up a bunch of packets and send them to the CPU all at once. But that will increase the latency of each of those packets. And unless you're buying special NICs from like SolarFlare that were designed for high frequency trading, where they throw away some throughput in order to get better latency, then you're going to still run into all of these problems.
I'm sure those are easy to find and inexpensive, right?
Being that they're discontinued, probably yes, actually.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenariesysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.